we're gonna shift gears a little bit to move to a different part of the world, and that is Asia.
Pivot to Asia.
So quite a bit. Yeah, we're gonna. Oh, wow, that's a good one. Holy crap. We are going to pivot to Asia. If you saw the news this week, you saw that President Donald Trump visited South Korea for the APEC Summit. And he faces global backlash over these one-sided trade deals that he's got even American allies upset over, which included a $200 billion payout from South Korea and pressure on the country to increase defense spending. And that meant, of course, buying U.S. weapons. And in a striking display that I think shocked all of us, the South Korean president presented Donald Trump with a golden crown, highlighting the extreme flattery leaders are using to try to appease Donald Trump. And I believe we have a clip of that. Oh, God, such embarrassing crowning.
Connection between the authority of the heavens and sovereignty on earth, as well as the strong leadership and authority of a leader.
경주를 국비대로 차리신 우리 트럼프 대통령님께 한반도의 처음으로 평화를 가져온 신라의 정신과 함께 한미 동맹의 푸른기를 상징하는 이 금관을 선물로 준비하였습니다.
We present this gold crown to you on this joyous occasion of your state visit to Gyeongju, because it symbolizes the spirit of Silla, which brought peace to the Korean peninsula for the first time, and the opening of the golden age of the Korea-U.S. alliance.
Oh my God, that is just so embarrassing and honestly reminds me of the display. I think it was maybe the Prime Minister of Pakistan at that Gaza peace signing, who was like, I nominate Donald Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize. We love you, sir. You're so hot. I mean, at that point, like, it's just
really just
pathetic.
What are we
groveling.
doing here?
I don't even know. But joining us to figure out what we're doing here is Ju-Hyun Park, member of Nodutdol and Web Editor here at Breakthrough News to discuss the Korea trade deal, protests against U.S. economic coercion, the growing resistance of workers in Asia, and Trump's upcoming meeting with China's Xi Jinping amidst escalating trade tensions. Ju-Hyun, welcome to the show.
Rania, great to be back. Zoe, good to be here with you too.
Glad you're here.
Well, yeah, because we got to make sense of this display of groveling. Let's start there. Let's start with that display of groveling from the South Korean president. What the hell? Go.
I wish I could explain it, to be entirely frank with you. It's definitely over the top. I think it caught a lot of people by surprise. The crown that was gifted is actually a replica of a national treasure of, one of the crowns from the Silla dynasty, which is one of the original, kingdoms of the Korean peninsula. And so, this is effectively giving a replica of any other national treasure from any other country. I think maybe the best analog I can think of is being gifted an oil replica of the Mona Lisa or something to that effect, maybe a replica of the crown of the Queen of England. It's just a little bit beyond what you would expect. Well, not just a little bit, but it's extremely beyond what you would expect from typical state-to-state relations. Absolutely. I think it, is also a sign of the massive pressure that South Korea is under in the tariff negotiations. For the last 6 months, give or take, the US and South Korea have been locked in these tariff negotiations after the Trump administration initially threatened 25% tariffs on all Korean goods. That number has now been reduced to 15%, but in exchange, South Korea is having to put up $350 billion of state-backed investments, $200 billion of which we are now finding out will be made in cash. And that's going to happen over the next 4 years. There was a lot of back and forth over this, particularly given the threat that this posed to South Korea's foreign currency markets. And I think, even though the deal is not quite as onerous and extensive as the Trump administration still wanted, it still poses a pretty incredible economic threat to South Korea's long-term solvency, because essentially what the Trump administration is going for here is to import many of South Korea's most productive and important industries into the United States, which would push South Korea down on the ladder economically in terms of its global standing. And in addition to that, As we've discussed on this show many times, Washington has incredible political, military leverage over Seoul. And I think all of that comes into play when we consider, the way in which these negotiations shake out. We have to remember that it is the US that ultimately has operational wartime control of South Korea's military. That is something President Lee Jae-myung, who, was just in that video clip you saw there presenting that crown to Trump, that is something he says he wants to get back by 2030. But whether or not that will be successful, of course, has yet to be seen.
There's so much to get into here, and I think some of the clips that are playing on screen of these mass protests is a really key point. But I wanted to touch back to kind of this broader issue of the tariff talks, and it seems crazy. I mean, we're 10 months into Trump's presidency, and he has, in a sense, proven that through force, through threats, and through really the power of the dollar, he can actually force all of these countries to bow down, to essentially give up their own national sovereignty and to give the U.S. the best conditions possible, even with allies. I think the case of South Korea is just kind of a slap in the face, a country that has already ceded so much of its sovereignty. However, I wanted to get to maybe what was the headline today, which was the much awaited and much expected Trump and Xi meeting. Reportedly, they finally reached an agreement. What is your take on this? Is this good for the global South? Did Trump really kind of get what he wanted? Did Xi get what he wanted? Tell us all about it.
Right. So, well, I'm sure that there will be an outstanding episode of the China Report on this. So let's start there. But I think when it comes to, the Trump-Xi meeting, which of course was highly anticipated, we have to remember that over the last month, the trade dispute between Beijing and Washington has really accelerated. China made the move to reassert its export controls over rare earths, which are critical for pretty much all modern technologies. And from what we've learned so far out of, their meeting that was held, they've more or less called a truce in the trade war for, they say, up until the next year. The People's Republic of China has agreed to start repurchasing soybeans from the US, though from what I understand, it is actually at a lower quantity than what they were purchasing before. They are relaxing and lifting those export controls on rare earths. And, the Trump administration is also responding by, peeling back a lot of the measures that it had taken against Chinese exports, against Chinese shipping as well. As for, is this good for the global South? I think it's difficult to say, in these times. Absolutely, we know that, increased trade wars and, this kind of increased tension in the Pacific doesn't really benefit anyone except, a certain class of, American political elite. But aside from that, I think this broader question of Trump's tariffs and their effects on the global South are really one of the kind of undertold stories of this year. Because I think what we need to understand is that this is really US imperialism reasserting itself, finding new ways to hold on to its position at the perch of the world capitalist system. And, I think for anyone that is concerned with multipolarity or with the rise of kind of alternate powers and an alternate system beyond the US dominated so-called rules-based order, there really needs to be an understanding that, the intention of these tariffs is to keep the US in its place, to firmly tighten the leash around all US allies through financial measures, and also to really limit the possibilities of global South countries that are currently lower income, middle income from rising above and being able to, change their economic situation in the near to intermediate term, because the world still does largely operate in a way where the US is the largest market. A lot of production around the world does rely on the US in order to realize profits from their own production. And so I think that, what's been going on with Trump's tariff wars around the world is hugely significant for the global South. It's bigger than just what's happening in this particular dispute with China, but we really have to look at the cumulative effect. And I think that, what we may see is that a lot of the rising possibilities that were anticipated in the global South are certainly going to be blunted, although I don't want to say that they'll necessarily be stopped by these developments, since there is a particular trend that is happening.
Yeah, I mean, it's really insane. And you would also think, Ju-Hyun, that all of this would be pushing these US allied countries in the region closer to China. rather than having them grovel with crowns for Donald Trump. But I mean, obviously that's like a very symbolic display, but this isn't, I don't think, sustainable. This kind of bullying behavior towards your allies, right? So I'm just curious, like, what do you think about the prospects down the line of the US being able to just maintain these relationships based purely on bullying? I mean, it might work in the short term, but in the long term?
I think down the line we'll need to see. I think what we can say is that in a lot of East Asian countries right now, there has been a tendency to pursue a kind of two-track strategy over the last 10 years where they attempt to both widen their economic relations with China and at the same time maintain political and especially military relations with the US. And starting really under the first Trump administration, then picked up under Biden, and now really being accelerated under this Trump term, is an attempt by the US to really economically discipline these countries through these tariff measures. And I think that, that's essentially what we're seeing, right? The US is not just going for these one-time payments and investments. They're essentially going for leverage against these countries, right? They're going for ways to import production from countries like South Korea and many of the important industries like batteries, automakers, shipbuilding. Part of that $350 billion that South Korea has pledged to, will 150 billion of it will go towards this project known as Make American Shipbuilding Great Again. They're going to actually be building South Korean nuclear submarines in Philadelphia, for example. And there will be South Korean shipbuilding conglomerates, some of the biggest heavyweights in the ship planet, that will be infusing massive sums of capital into the US in order to build up the shipbuilding industry in the US. So economically, what this is doing is that it's a way of kind of cannibalizing the economies of East Asia in a way that actually increases dependency over time. And so while, I think many of us would like to believe that, the bullying will have to reach a limit at some point, people's dignity will just simply have to assert itself. I think that, what's actually going to make the difference is whether or not movements are able to rise that can politically challenge the current leadership in a lot of these countries, which, it just has to be said, are not putting forward the real kind of like dedication to sovereignty that's necessary in the world that we're living in today. I mean, we can look at Japan's tariff deal just as one example. Japan pledged $550 billion in investment, and Donald Trump essentially gets to personally control where those investments go. And I think that that's really important for US workers to pay attention to as well, because while the Trump administration is saying that all these measures are going to create US jobs, I think it does remain to be seen, well, will they? Will they actually go towards creating US jobs, or will they, go towards building perhaps industrial capacity, create a limited number of jobs? How much of it is going to be funneled towards AI? How much of it will be simply wasted through corruption? And I think that we need to kind of understand this moment as not unlike the bailouts that we saw in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, where you had huge sums of capital being infused into the economy in the names of saving it. But the actual real conditions that face the working class in the US got worse as a result. And inequality certainly widened. I think that, that may well be the outcome that we see in the US as well, as the years tell with time.
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say,
we're going to keep doing this. We'll get it right. We'll get it right.
I mean, we have maybe 1 minute left. I don't know, Ju-Hyun, if you can just tell us quickly, there have been these protests almost every single day by movements in South Korea, trade unions, popular movements. What are people saying on the streets right now?
On the streets right now, people have been saying for a long time that these demands need to be totally rejected. There is no acceptable level of investment to be made in the US, right? These are state-backed investments, which means that they are backstopped by the taxpayer. So this is money from Korea's working class, which is going into the pockets of Wall Street. And that is something that people are very upset about. And I think that, rightfully people are asking, what kind of alliance is this, right? Is this actually a partnership between equals? And I think pretty plainly the answer is no. And, that being the case, we know what the solution is. It's US out of Korea. You can check out Nodutdol's US out of Korea campaign at usoutofkorea.org to learn more about that. But it is simply the case that, people, the organized workers, the progressive social movements of South Korea for months have been calling for the president to assert sovereignty. And there was a just total failure to achieve that in the last couple of days. And instead, there was quite literally a crown being given to the president of the United States, who, it must be said, has been facing so-called no kings protests for months now on his own. And it seems that, South Korea's ruling elite's answer is to actually say, yes, kings. And I don't think that's something that anyone should accept.
Well, Ju-Hyun, I'm so happy that we can have you on this show to break all this down. It's a story that will continue to develop, so we'll be doing it again in the near future. But thank you so much for joining us on the Freedom Side Live.
Thanks for having me again.